Welcome to Business Unmuted, the Northern Business podcast, sponsored by Virtue Motors, one of the UK's largest motor retailers. Check out its website at virtuemotors.com. I'm Graham Robb and I've owned Recognition PR for nearly 35 years. We've got 75 clients based across the UK. Between them, they have a turnover of around £6 billion and employ 30,000 people. So we're at the front line of the business community and perfectly placed to discuss the economic climate. Make sure you never miss an episode of Business Unmuted by subscribing on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. In the studio today, we've got Graham Soult, a high street expert and the founder of retail consultancy cannyinsights.com. Down the line, we've Stephen Patterson, Chief Executive of Newcastle NE1, the Newcastle Business Improvement District, the biggest business improvement district in the UK. And also down the line, we've John Ashmore, editor of CapX, the media arm for the Centre for Policy Studies. Welcome all. And now before I get to talk to you all, I just want to tell our viewers I've been away for a couple of weeks. I've been to Philadelphia. I went for my daughter's wedding, but I stayed back a few days to talk to someone who runs a PR firm like mine and is connected with the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, a guy called Jay Devine. And we swapped brochures about our respective economic areas. Very interesting to visit the US at the moment. There's a lot of economic growth going on. There's a lot of entrepreneurial activity. In the city of Philadelphia, it was quite a buzzy place to be, very similar to the north of England in its demographics, and focusing on ed and med, education with the state of Pennsylvania's university, Penn University, and research into lots of medical things. They discovered the BRCA1 gene there, so a lot of gene therapy jobs, and similar kind of economic challenges that we have here, the levelling up of certain communities and also the recruitment of skilled and retention of skilled staff in their economic zone. So it was a very interesting trip. John, what do you make of our economy at the moment? Viewed from CapX, all right, in the centre of London, you talk to a lot of people who are in the swim of government policy. There's been a lot of data coming out. The most interesting comments this week were from the Bank of England economist who said we've all got to get used to being poorer.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think Hugh Pill is right, but not in the sense that he intended. I think that our politicians have been tacitly telling us for the best part of a generation that we kind of need to accept decline as a country. And I mean that in the sense that we simply don't get the things built that we need as a country in order to enable us to prosper. If you want to build here in London, the Lower Thames Crossing, for example, you need thousands of pages of documentation. The planning consultation is set to be in the London Stadium, which gives you some idea of what we're up against. But what Hugh Pill was talking about was inflation. He was kind of reiterating what Andrew Bailey said a few months ago when he said that people shouldn't ask for wage rises because that would contribute to what we call the wage price spiral. So people constantly bidding up. In pure PR terms, a really silly thing for either of them to say, because I mean, it sounds horrendously out of touch for people on six-figure salaries to be telling people lower down the kind of economic food chain that they shouldn't be asking for pay rises, especially when you see the price of goods in the shop going up, especially the price of food, some staples going up sort of 15, 20% over the course of a year. There's no sugarcoating the fact that the economy looks pretty bleak at the moment. I mean, Graham and Stephen can probably speak to the effect on the retail of inflation. But I mean, high energy prices feed through to pretty much everything, even to putting the lights and heating an office. You know, the cost of delivering pretty much anything in the UK and across most of Europe is much higher now than it was a year ago. Obviously, we can put this down to what we hope are temporary factors, like the war in Ukraine being the most obvious one, the pandemic and supply shock that came from that. But the brutal truth is also that we have not been making the right decisions on our infrastructure, things like gas storage, things like power stations, nuclear. There was a transmission cable from Portsmouth to France that didn't get built because it would have obscured the sight line of something or other. I mean, we make consistently absurd decisions about infrastructure and then act surprised when things are expensive, things haven't been built, and you know, we're not up to the level of our competitor countries. It costs 10 times as much to build a mile of high-speed rail here than it does in Spain. You know, there are some extenuating reasons for that, but fundamentally everything is much too expensive in Britain for what are fundamentally political reasons. And I just think we need to kind of open our eyes as a nation and realise that we are on a path to decline if we don't change that.
I know Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, tried to explain, and I watched his speech with great interest. I know him, and I watched it with great interest. Every time he gave a subsidy or a support, whether it be the furlough or Sybil's loans, he did always say these will have to be paid for, and I'm looking forward to the days I can return to being a tax-cutting Chancellor, not a tax-rising Chancellor, and so on. But in the end, you know, £500 billion worth of extra borrowing cannot be paid for without some kind of pain. And it seems to me that government policy, not necessarily political policy, but policy that's driven through different unrelated arms of government, is contributing to inflation. I'll give you some thoughts. Ofcom, it's an arm of government but independent, yet it allowed telecoms prices to go up by RPI plus 3.9% last year. Its mind was off the ball, didn't have inflation in its mind. The Bank of England itself being late on interest rate rises. That kind of thing will contribute to inflation.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on what you mentioned about the Bank of England, because my view, is an ultra cynical view, is that what Andrew Bailey and Hugh Pill are really doing here is kind of deflecting from the bank's own long-term policy failures. We've had this, and this goes for the whole kind of Western monetary world, right? It's not just the UK. We've had rates that were really low for a really long time, and that's fed into all sorts of negative consequences. It's increased inequality. If you're an asset owner, it was very good. If you weren't, it was very bad. So it's easier to create a bit of a stink about some comments you've made in a podcast than to face up to the fact that perhaps the bank has been asleep at the wheel, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England.
And quantitative easing, I've seen adverts on American-based TV channels and radio channels throughout the last 5 or 6 years saying the governments of the world are printing money, come on, buy the relevant bonds. And actually openly advertising the mistake they're making, because there was a lot of money printed, and it went on, perhaps, and certainly in my personal view, maybe in yours, I don't put words in your mouth, it went on too long and too far.
Yeah, I mean, I should stress I'm not an expert on monetary policy like as some of the economic commentary are, but it strikes me, having spoken to people who are, that quantitative easing was the right answer for, as you say, during the immediate post-financial crisis years, but it took far too long to unwind it, and also to raise interest rates when they had been flat for such a very long time. If you compare effective interest rates in, say, the 1980s to now, there's a really big gap between them. But I think we shouldn't concentrate only on monetary policy. It's one part of it, but there are all those other things that we spoke about, supply constraints. We've also got really big problems in our labour market. Yeah. So it's a very complex kind of textured thing. But to be honest, I think the idea that people asking for wage rises is going to make any difference either way, I think is sort of illusory. And like I say, it feels like a distraction from those other broader issues.
And as well as monetary policy and tax and public pay policy, there is also regulatory policy. If you look at a very popular show like Clarkson's Farm on Amazon, there are some takeaways from that. The bureaucracy that Clarkson illustrates that comes out of DEFRA, and the environmental policy in some ways out of DEFRA, with increasing rewilding and fewer acres of land available for, say, dairy farming, that is going to drive food costs up, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one side of it. The thing that my particular bugbear, and one we talk about a lot on my website, CapX, is the effect of those regulations on housing. Obviously, the big meta thing here is the planning system, the Town and Country Planning Act, which was put in place in the 40s after the war. But you mentioned environmental regulation. There's about 100,000 homes that are waiting to be built that can't be because of Natural England's nutrient neutrality rules, which sounds a bit obscure. But if any of your
there'll be a lot of viewers in the northeast facing problems, and Yorkshire on this, because there are quite a few planning decisions being held up.
It seems like madness to me when we're struggling so much with housing starts anyway. particularly in sort of urban areas where the demand is highest, where rents now are getting completely out of control. We talk about it a lot here in London, obviously, because rents are so high, but it's not just a London problem. It's wages to prices are completely out of kilter all over the country. And it just seems to me that we don't have the political will to take on, particularly now the Tory MPs are looking at quite nervously at their electorates. They don't have the will to take on quite well-organised, sort of NIMBY-ish tendencies in their own patch.
Right, I'm going to end this little bit of the conversation, John, on a more positive note. There's some figures that were released the other day by ONS. Now, they're a bit old, actually. They're last year's data, but they've compiled it relating to the pandemic. Now, some of them say that compared to pre-pandemic, our economy has shifted downwards. The northeast, compared to pre-pandemic, has dropped about 5%. But compared to the peak pandemic, the north of England has grown quite well. 7.5% growth in the UK generally since peak pandemic, 9.4% in the northeast, Yorkshire 9.9% and 9.9% in the northwest. I flashed that up to screen for viewers. Do you think that the country is now getting to grips with getting out of the post-pandemic malaise?
I think we are, in terms of rebounding, somewhere where we were before, but the brutal truth is that we were on a pretty middling, we were bumping along the bottom even before COVID hit. Growth in this country has been anemic for more than a decade. And that's, people love to pin it on, say, Brexit, or the pandemic. It's very convenient for ministers to say that it's because of COVID and not because of their own government's 13 years of their own government's policies. But we have not had consistent, decent growth in this country for a very long time, and I think we've been kidding ourselves by saying that, we had the best growth in the G7 over the last year. Well, it's because we started from the lowest base in the G7. It's not because we suddenly produced some sort of economic miracle. I should say, I think there are plenty of people in Westminster and beyond who get this. It's just trying to fit in the necessary policies around the kind of electoral realities that there is a large constituency of property owning older voters who generally vote Conservative, who are very averse to change. Okay. And especially the kind of change that we need. And that's, in my view, that's the kind of blunt reality of it.
John, we'll just park you there. We'll come back to you at the end of the next bit of the discussion. Next, we'll focus on one bit of the economy. We had a more holistic view there from John, and that's retail. Graham, welcome to the programme. John, welcome to the programme. First of all, Graham, flash up the most recent retail data. We saw retail sales down, non-food sales the worst, online sales a little bit better, but generally just under 1% diminished on retail sales. When they were last issued, and that's from February, March, over a month, the most recent snapshot. And by the way, some of the interpretation was that we're down because of bad weather. I don't know if that's a good reason. What would you think the reason would be that they're down?
Yeah, I suppose I'm a bit sceptical when it comes to data, because I get bombarded with data of all sorts around retail sales and confidence and footfall and empty shops. So I've learnt by now to kind of not get too obsessed with one set of data, but to try and see it in the round, I suppose. But clearly, retail is finding it quite hard going, as inflation is incredibly high. People, I think, are experiencing inflation that they haven't experienced before in most of our lifetimes. And so that, of course, is having an impact on sales volumes. So people are spending more, but they're still buying only about the same or a bit less than they would be ordinarily. So as that clearly is an issue, and we're seeing that in terms of where people are shopping, that is changing as well. So we're seeing Aldi and Lidl, for example, kind of really growing their market share again in the way that they always seem to when there's an economic downturn.
Is there enough competition on other types of retail? Take petrol, fuel at supermarkets. You get almost local cartels. I'm based in the town of Darlington, and the petrol price will be virtually the same at every petrol station in this town. But if you travel a little bit further away, say to Bishop Auckland, you can get 10 pence a litre less. But the cost of the petrol to go from that town to the next town it doesn't make it worthwhile. Is there anything about, particularly on fuel, where there is a sort of not nearly enough competition in the market?
Yeah, I'm not a driver, so I'm probably not the best person to ask this question to, but I know, for example, that obviously in recent years the owners of kind of EG, Euro Garages, bought Asda. So I think some people would certainly claim that Asda perhaps isn't as competitive in fuel pricing as it used to be. And certainly I've seen that in the past it would have been the supermarkets that you would go to kind of get the best prices, and that I think has changed. Often these days, in my experience, it's not the supermarkets who are leading on the fuel pricing. It's often they're more familiar brands, Shell, BP, that kind of thing.
That's interesting. Now, we'll come back to you in a moment, but there is one organisation which I've got to be fair, just to explain, we do a bit of work with this organisation, which is NE1, the Newcastle Business Improvement District. Now, we just heard the explanation that retail sales were down because of the weather. It was pouring down last Saturday, and I went out shopping in Newcastle because it was raining. I thought, well, I don't want to walk in the country today. It's terrible weather. And I spent the day in a rather nice department store, which has a nice champagne bar, which was a very civilised way to spend Saturday in the pouring rain. What's your view on the reason the retail's down and the offer that cities like you have to propose to the customer?
I think, as Graham mentions, when it comes to retail sales, with the current market conditions, I think what we've actually seen is a polarization of where people are choosing to spend their money. So I think if you speak to retailers, both in city centres and retail parks, they tend to be doing quite well. Whereas I think those traditional town centres, those typically, second or third tier retail destinations seem to be in significant decline. If you look at, say, Eldon Square, which no doubt you were in at the weekend, if you managed to tear yourself away from the champagne bar, Graham, their vacancy rate, I think, in the minute is in the low single digits, which, when you consider the national retail vacancy rate is about 14%, they're doing really, really well. So I think what you see in times of stress is really customers and retailers flocking to those destinations with the surest signs of success and the lowest risk.
Let's drill down to some of the reasons that your bid has managed to stand out a little. I mean, you've been very modest, but I've seen some of the data, and Newcastle is beating the trend. And there's no question about it. You can tell our viewers and listeners how in a minute. But what is the methodology you've brought to it to make it beat the trend?
I think our methodology is relatively simple. We tend to look at Newcastle not in sort of sectoral silos like retail, leisure, F&B, hospitality, professional services, but rather look at the city as a whole, and also, I suppose, what we call low-hanging fruit, those assets that we have that are genuinely world-class, but we just don't make the most of. And we work very closely with business, which is really important because you're benefiting from their in-depth sectoral knowledge and experience, most often at zero cost. I hasten to add, they're passionate about the city and they wanted to improve. So you tend to get from point A to point B in a really quick time. Notwithstanding, we work with our partners in terms of the City Council, the police, Northumbria Police, that side of things. But as I think John touched on before, decision making, certainly at the national public sector level locally, doesn't tend to be designed to be quick or necessarily produce the best outcome in terms of the decision that is eventually reached.
You've gone for something that it looks to me as an outsider looking in. You've supplemented the police presence on the city centre with rangers. I felt on Saturday when I was there very safe, and you do seem to have a really good offer. What do the rangers do, and what's all that been about?
The Street Rangers very much working in response to concerns from businesses and the general public. Newcastle is the safest of the core cities in the UK. So there's no doubt about that. I think what the Street Rangers are really there to tackle is perceptions of safety, not necessarily the reality in terms of crime. And a lot of that comes down to antisocial behaviour, whether that's intoxicated people on the street, graffiti, things like that. So really our street rangers act as eyes and ears on the ground, boots on the ground. That's what people want to see. That's what businesses and people feel reassured by.
And you've done something about shoplifting policy as well as a result. Could you just illustrate that and the scale of the problem?
Well, the scale of the problem is probably Newcastle's loss rate, very similar across the country, has probably doubled from about 1% per annum to 2% in about 10 years. What we're doing differently in Newcastle is we have business crime reduction partnership, which makes information sharing really easy and reporting. And currently we are seeing really our NE1 street rangers recovering around about 80% of retail thefts that are reported via this. So our guys are out on the street, the retailers in store, when they come, the thieves move outdoors, will report it to us, and then we apprehend and recover goods. I'm saying apprehend, we don't have arrest powers, but more often than not, simply if they're confronted, they tend to hand over the goods.
And the value of those goods, you were saying to me the other week, it's like if you did it over a year, it'd be like the Brinksmack robbery.
Yeah, I think it's, Newcastle's the dominant retail destination in the region with 25, 26 million footfall per year in Eldon Square. Retail sales of in excess of £1 billion. But when you look at thefts from store, that's probably running at around about 20 million per annum, which is not far away from the Brinksmack gold bullion robbery. So it really puts it in context. It might just be a handbag or some cheese or some steak from a retailer, but when you add it all together over the year, it's a significant amount of money.
Okay, now let's go back to Graham. You've heard, it's an interesting story what's happening in Newcastle, actually. Whenever I talk to Stephen, I find it fascinating. How does that contrast with, you go around all the different types of towns, different markets, provincial towns seem to be moving towards independent shops and destinations about their history. City centres, that kind of initiative. Is that happening in other city centres in the north of England?
Yeah, obviously lots of towns and cities have a BID, a business improvement district, but I would always say, and I do champion Newcastle, I say in terms of bids, Newcastle's bid is very good at the work that it does. It's one of the better ones. But I think certainly if you look at what's happening across towns and cities of different sizes, it's very mixed really. So I think Stephen's right in that big cities like Newcastle have bounced back fairly robustly, although the footfall patterns are different because people are working differently. Equally, some of the smaller towns, even suburban parades and smaller town centres, are doing okay actually, because those are the places where people are working from home still and spending more time. So in many cases, those smaller towns did quite well during COVID because people were suddenly there more. And at least some of that has stuck. And those places are also often quite good places to start independent businesses because it's more affordable. It's still quite a challenge to start an independent business in a place like Newcastle or even in Durham, because although business rates have fallen in many places since the 1st of April because of the revaluation, so in Durham rates are down by about a third on average, which is
very good. Yeah.
It's really encouraging, but it can still be quite a hurdle to find a unit that's suitable for an independent in a place like that. And so certainly I would hope that as the market continues to evolve, it would be fantastic if over time, more independents can start to embed themselves in the centre of Newcastle, and not just independent retail, but as we were hearing, kind of a whole mix of leisure and food and drink and all kinds of other stuff as well.
In your experience, is there any absolutely golden ideas that you see in the course of your days in your consultancy that you think government could, or even local government could adopt universally that would make a difference?
Yeah, as you'll know, I'm involved in the High Streets Task Force, which was set up by government 4 years ago, and that is all about sharing good practice and trying to send experts like me out and about around the country to work with local authorities and to get them moving forward. And in many cases, places that are doing well are those where you do have really strong leadership, and that might be a council, it might be a bid as well, it might be all those partners working together, but certainly places that do have really good partnerships are the ones that are often doing well. So somewhere where if you've got councils, bids, businesses, other key stakeholders, police as well, all working in partnership, those are the places where you're starting to see things happening, because you can't control everything. You can't control inflation and business rates and things, but there's a lot of things that you can control locally, and bids like NE1 are often at the forefront of providing that place leadership.
All right, I'm going to give the last word to John. You were listening to our retail guys talk. Were there any takeaways you've, having heard them, would consider that maybe CPS would look at and advocate?
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to say that I probably came across being excessively gloomy in my first contribution. I mean, listening to the guys talking, I mean, we are a country with fantastic retailers, beautiful towns, just so many strengths. And that's really what frustrates people like me who work in the kind of policy world, that we have so much potential, that Britain to me feels like a kind of uncoiled spring where we could be doing so much better if we put some of the right policies in place. I mean, there's a great deal there. I was very struck by what Stephen said about shoplifting in particular. I think crime it's already high on the agenda, but it's going to be really big at the next election. Not just shoplifting, but fraud as well for online people who do a lot of their shopping online. It's a massive thing. We have this very strange anomaly where fraud is just not included by politicians in crime statistics, even though it's one of the biggest things. But yeah, certainly, I mean, we in the CPS, the think tank that CapX is part of, we do a lot of work on retail. Business rates was something mentioned. We'd like to see that reformed, certainly. I think a lot of retailers would probably agree. It's a very unsatisfactory system. It's extremely burdensome. The fact that we do it based on rateable value instead of profit, I think is bizarre. So, I mean, there's lots of things. Personally, and this is not CPS policy necessarily, I think that we are far too centralised as a country. Graham said there is a lot local government can do, but it's a real like hodgepodge at the moment. We have mayors in some places with lots of powers. In other places, they don't have mayors. That can be good and bad. We have a kind of laboratory of policy in that way. But I think I would personally like to see local government give them a bit more control over their finances, a bit more autonomy in terms of tax raising. They have tiny little tweaks to council taxes and things they can do at the moment. But yeah, I think there's plenty for all of us in our various with our various hats on to get stuck into. And I think that we can have a bright economic and retail future if we make the right decisions.
Well, John, that's a very interesting bookend to our. I introduced at the beginning talking about Philadelphia, where I'd visited, where they've got what they describe in the Philadelphia magazine I brought back as the most consequential mayor's race in history. It really is important, and in where Stephen is, there's going to be the first mayor's race pretty soon for their new devolved deal. But thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. By the way, it'll be our 100th episode of Business Unmuted soon, and we'll be changing the name of the podcast to the Northern Business Podcast. Never miss an episode. You can like, rate and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Join us again soon.